The battlefield, a cacophony of chaos, echoed with the piercing screams of the wounded and the ominous sound of steel cleaving through flesh. The gladius struck with lethal precision, and blood poured forth, painting the ground crimson. They called it Roman glory, yet in that harrowing moment it evoked a sense of hellish torment rather than triumph. But what follows the clamor of war? What becomes of the soldiers who survive the maelstrom? This inquiry does not concern those who meet their end with honor on the field. Rather, it seeks to understand the plight of those who return broken in body and torn apart in spirit. In Rome, generals basked in the adulation of victory, honored by elaborate triumphal arches, while the gods were appeased with lavish sacrifices celebrating each conquest. Yet, the common soldiers, those who bore the true burden of war, came back altered, marked by scars and disfigurement, bearing wounds unseen by society's eye. This narrative aims to illuminate their forgotten stories. Those who returned but ultimately never re-entered the world they once knew. We delve into the lives of wounded soldiers in ancient Rome because the grim reality of war often reveals itself only after the final battle has been fought. Roman warfare was characterized by its brutality and intimacy, with no safe distance separating combatants. Every encounter, every strike, was executed with a silent efficiency that turned men into effective instruments of death. Yet, when wounds did not prove fatal, they left indelible scars, both physical and mental. Spears and pilums tore through flesh and shattered bone, frequently resulting in limbs being violently severed. Darts with heavy, curved tips were crafted to deform upon impact, complicating their extraction and causing internal lacerations that quickly became infected. When facing warriors from barbarian tribes, be it the Celts or Germanic fighters, the destruction wrought by combat was often even more devastating. Their primitive armaments included axes that could cleave entire arms asunder and maces that crushed skulls, leaving behind ghastly wounds. Roman medical texts, particularly Aulus Cornelius Celsus's De Medicina, describe injuries that stretch the limits of human endurance: exposed entrails, shattered bones, missing teeth, mutilated faces. Many who briefly survived the battlefield succumbed days later to infections, fevers, or silent necrosis, as there was little time or resources for sterilization. The wounded fell upon filthy ground mixed with mud, excrement, and the lifeblood of other men, fallen comrades, and ill-fated animals alike. If fortunate, they were dragged away to receive aid. If not, they remained abandoned until the fighting ceased. Yet, the agony did not cease with the fighting. In many cases, it had merely begun. Among those who bore the mark of survival, the mind did not always follow. There existed another unseen war, an invisible struggle. Some soldiers returned without externally visible injuries, no gaping wounds or missing limbs. However, something intangible within them had fractured. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) was a reality in ancient Rome, albeit devoid of nomenclature, diagnosis, and worse yet, compassion. Many endured in silence, trapped in a cycle of insomnia, sudden bursts of rage, irrational fears, and profound isolation. A significant number drifted to the fringes of society, struggling to reconnect with family and community, while others chose to return to military service not out of loyalty, but out of desperation. Roman culture failed to perceive this suffering as a product of conflict. Instead, it was dismissed as weakness, a lack of virtue. A good man, they proclaimed, bears all adversity with dignity. To display strong emotions was seen as suspicious. To suffer silently was expected, a principle of manliness. The Roman historian Tacitus recounted veterans from Germanic campaigns who recoiled from societal interactions, avoiding communal celebrations and human connection. For them, simply recalling the battlefield was enough to unleash an unbearable torrent of grief. They lived on, but a part of their spirit had perished amidst the bloodshed. While Rome mastered the art of creating soldiers and triumphant armies, it failed or perhaps chose not to nurture those who returned with invisible scars, discomfort and pain that did not bleed when unnoticed by the empire. The men who tended to those grievous wounds, the medici, or legionary doctors, exhibited their own brand of courage. These military physicians were not tasked with saving lives in a contemporary sense, but were trained to sustain soldiers long enough for them to continue serving. Roman medical practices were starkly pragmatic, with every permanent military encampment housing a valetudinarium or military hospital divided into sections for various types of care: open wounds, fever, infections, and recovery. The Medici operated on the teachings of classical authors like Celsus, Galen, and Dioscorides. Their methods included using vinegar and wine as rudimentary antiseptics and utilizing plants like mandrake or willow bark to alleviate pain. But when faced with severe injuries, miracles were non-existent. Cauterization with red-hot iron bars was the last resort to stop uncontrollable bleeding. If a wound turned gangrenous, amputation became the daunting alternative. The instruments they wielded, bronze saws, iron hooks, and crude forceps, were as inadequate as the methods for anesthesia, which consisted merely of wine and rudimentary herbal sedatives. The agonized screams of the wounded were reported to reverberate throughout entire camps. The mortality rate for wounded soldiers was alarmingly high, yet the Medici commanded both fear and respect in their roles, not because of their healing capabilities, but due to their authority in deciding which lives to save, whose limbs to lose, and who would face the final sunrise. They were not healers in the truest sense, but emergency surgeons in a time when every cut could be a death sentence. Even those who managed to evade the operating table and survive their wounds faced another daunting challenge: navigating the perilous journey away from the battlefield and toward potential recovery. For those severely injured and far from a permanent camp, transport conditions could only be described as inhumane. Makeshift stretchers fashioned from spears and cloaks or oxen-drawn carts traversed the stone and mud-laden roads. Each jolt brought a renewed wave of torture. Roman logistics excelled in efficiency but lacked humanitarian compassion. The primary concern was the prompt removal of the wounded from imminent danger, not to alleviate their pain. In the wake of battle, many succumbed along the harrowing journey home, left to agonize in silence along the bumpy Roman roads. During imperial times, advancements in military infrastructure did bring about improvements, establishing valetudinaria as the norm in larger, permanent camps. These rudimentary facilities featured designated areas for various treatments, some rudimentary drainage systems for wastewater, wooden beds, and basic stocks of surgical instruments. However, even within these centers, conditions remained perilously inadequate. With little understanding of germs and bacteria, infections were virtually guaranteed. Soldiers could evade an enemy's sword, yet succumb to the insidious microorganisms thriving within their open wounds and unsterilized tools. In the quietude of the valetudinarium, far removed from the cacophony of battle, the struggle for survival shifted focus. It became a war against time, infection, and the process of decay within the soldiers' own bodies. The most formidable adversary for the severely wounded was no longer the sword, but rather gangrene. Lacking antibiotics and a real grasp of bacterial infections, a mere puncture could spiral into a lethal source of necrosis, with tissue blackening and the ghastly odor heralding death well before the fever set in. The agony was often described as relentless, persistent burning, chills, delirium. While Roman physicians were seasoned practitioners, they were restricted to empirical solutions. Herbal compresses composed of elderflower, rue, and garlic were applied, some of which, as noted in Dioscorides' Materia Medica, provided meager relief. Yet, in many cases, these remedies only delayed the inevitable. Galen, one of the most esteemed physicians of antiquity, remarked that often the only recourse was amputation of the affected limb, a procedure fraught with peril, as improper hygiene could provoke septicemia, systemic infection following a localized wound. In this unrelenting struggle against infection, valor was an insufficient shield. It did not spare individuals from a slow demise. Even celebrated heroes met their end just like inexperienced recruits left to languish with fever and humble wooden beds at the periphery of an empire which could offer little solace. The battle against gangrene silent and unheroic reduced many to a state of suffering devoid of grand narratives or accolades. However, for those fortunate enough to endure, another daunting question loomed. What became of men who could no longer fight? Rome made grand promises to its soldiers, and some were indeed honored. Legionaries who served honorably for 2 decades or more earned the missio honesta, a dignified discharge that guaranteed significant compensation, land, a lifelong pension, and, for foreigners, Roman citizenship. Many of these veterans were resettled in military colonies, reestablishing their lives as farmers, merchants, and local leaders rewards for years spent shedding blood for the empire. Yet, heartbreakingly, most severely wounded veterans did not reach the threshold for such accolades. Many were discharged prematurely, classified under missio casaria medical discharge. While symbolically honorable, it offered none of the protections afforded by missio honesta. In practice, it stripped them of all state support, leaving them mutilated and without pension, land, or salary. These unfortunate soldiers became dependent on the compassion of relatives, the goodwill of their superiors, or sheer luck. The glory of Roman warriors rarely extended its hand to those unable to continue the fight. Monuments hailed the victories, lauding generals and the indomitable legions, yet the broken bodies who paved the way for these conquests received no such accolades, often returning to an indifferent home. Amidst the proud veterans celebrated in marble, countless forgotten souls languished, unseen and neglected in the shadows of society, mutilated, stigmatized, and often rebuffed by a culture that exalted strength while disparaging disability. Not all wounded men faced immediate rejection. The Roman army, pragmatic by nature, recognized that even impaired bodies could serve a purpose if their minds remained intact. Soldiers who could no longer fight were often reassigned roles. Many became scribae, managing bureaucratic records for the camp, supply records, payroll, accounting, movement reports, while others took on the role of instructors, imparting their experience to new recruits. Some were assigned as guards for supply depots or watchtowers, where the physical demands were less strenuous. This reassignment of wounded veterans occurred more frequently under organized and pragmatic governments like those of Trajan or Hadrian. However, during periods of political instability, economic crises, or prolonged warfare, these opportunities dried up. The availability of roles depended solely on the local commander's discretion, the contexts of the times, and the kindness of those in power. For many veterans, securing these bureaucratic roles offered a glimmer of dignity amidst the tumult, a way to navigate their existence within a system molded by a lifetime of sacrifice. Still, such opportunities were never guaranteed, and many faced disgrace, not for their wounds but for failures, their mistakes haunting them in a society where returning honorably from war was paramount. The missio ignominiosa represented the cruelest form of dismissal from the Roman army. Reserved for those accused of cowardice, desertion, indiscipline, or acts deemed unworthy of a soldier, it resulted in social condemnation. Expelled in disgrace, the man stripped of honor lost all rights, no pensions, no land, no recognition. His name vanished from records, marked with disdain and unable to reintegrate into a society that idolized ideals of masculinity rooted in strength, discipline, and valor. For many of these ex-soldiers, life became a relentless struggle for survival, living on the fringes of society, discarded, unprotected, and stripped of dignity. Inscriptions from frontier regions like Britannia reveal the existence of men who, even while wounded, carried the weight of disgrace to their graves. Accounts recount veterans shunned by their own families, treated as though they bore a moral contagion. In Roman society, virtues such as courage, discipline, and loyalty formed the bedrock of the masculine ideal. To be stripped of these, through injury or accusation, was to be cast out not only from the military but from the very essence of citizenship itself. For many wounded veterans, while the war may have concluded, their battles to survive remained ongoing. Devoid of guaranteed pensions, lands, or familial support, these men were compelled to find ways to earn a living despite their afflictions. Some utilized the meager sums they received upon leaving the army to establish small taverns, repair shops, or work as street vendors, while others sought minor municipal roles, market inspectors, urban guards, administrative aides. Though humble, these positions provided a modicum of stability and occasional respect. However, darker choices also loomed for some. Wounded yet still capable of wielding a weapon, many turned mercenary, selling their combat skills to senators, aristocrats, or merchant caravans. Others found their way into gladiator schools, where violence became a profession of a different nature now as entertainment. Figures like Spiculus, a renowned gladiator during Nero's reign, possibly emerged from military backgrounds. Though the arena offered fame and fortune, it also posed the threat of a swift demise. For many, this became a harsh yet necessary trade, exchanging personal honor for basic sustenance. The Rome that immortalized warriors in marble also commodified their suffering in brutal spectacles for the public. In the face of such bleak choices, the prospect of dying in the amphitheater sometimes appeared more dignified than fading into obscurity. For veterans who could neither obtain land, viable work, nor reintegration into society, the bleakest fate awaited, the struggle to survive without honor. In bustling urban centers such as Rome, Alexandria, or Carthage, countless former soldiers found themselves in destitution, living as beggars, displaying their amputated limbs, their visible scars met with empty stares. These men who once marched alongside the Midas legions now lingered in the shadows of grand temples. Many were unrecognized as veterans, overlooked not only by the state but by society at large, utterly forgotten. The glory that once sustained their spirits had dissipated into dust. Emperor Augustus attempted to address this pressing issue by instituting the Aurarium Military, a military fund financed by taxes meant for pension payments. In theory, it was a revolutionary step, a formal guarantee for those who had served. For a time, it succeeded, particularly under organized emperors like Vespasian. Yet, under rulers like Nero, the fund was either neglected or diverted for extravagant palace expenditures. In moments of hardship and crisis, the first to be disregarded were those who could no longer engage in combat. Countless veterans perished while waiting for pensions that never materialized. Others found solace in minor bureaucratic jobs offered by local commanders or governors. But many vanished, absorbed into the depths of an anonymous crowd within an empire that wielded their bodies as tools of war while neglecting to acknowledge their silent scars. Rome triumphed in battles across 3 continents, toppled kingdoms, and constructed cities adorned with enduring monuments. Yet nestled within every triumph immortalized in marble lies the truth of countless broken men, whose sacrifices went unrecognized by the very empire they fought for, a harrowing examination of those who endured beyond the battlefield, for whom silence was a more profound burden than the loudest clash of steel. This narrative is not one of generals or mythical triumphs. It is the tale of ordinary soldiers who returned home with missing limbs, lost eyes, fallen comrades, and their stories silenced a reflection on the cruel legacies of war and the men who sought merely to exist within a society that seldom recognized their scars.